seconds.
Is the monitor not going to come up? Welcome to another edition of Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer, and I'll be the host for today. I'm a professor of sociology at Western Michigan University, and also I probably should identify myself as a criminologist today, given the topic that we're going to talk about. And one of my research specialties is actually state crime, or crimes committed by government or state officials. With me, as usual, is Don Cooney. Don is a professor in the School of Social Work at Western, and he's also a city commissioner here in Kalamazoo. And we have two guests with us today. One guest has been with us many times before, Felix Brooks. Felix is an adjunct professor in the criminal justice program at Western Michigan University. He teaches courses on juvenile delinquency and juvenile justice for us. In a former life, he was a probation officer, and most recently, he has accepted a position at Kalamazoo Valley Community College. You're going to be the new Director of Diversity and Inclusion at KVCC. Yep. So congratulations on the new job. And also with us today is Cody Dekker. And Cody is with an organization in Kalamazoo called Kalamazoo for Justice. And Cody, I'm sure lots of people probably don't know a whole lot about your group, so why don't you talk a little bit about what Kalamazoo for Justice is about and what you're engaged in right now.
Sure. So we, a group of us, got to get Shannon Sykes, a peer and colleague of mine, who also works heavily in the organization right now, held a rally immediately after the death of Michael Brown. At that rally, we talked about going to Ferguson. 5 of us showed up to a meeting to go to Ferguson. That trip did not happen, but out of that meeting, we decided we wanted to do something in this city, and that the problem, Ferguson, was everywhere. And so about 4 of us founded an organization, Kalamazoo for Justice, to work on public safety and criminal justice, systemic oppression, specifically towards people of color in the city. And so we've been working for the past 3 months on that in Kalamazoo.
Okay. So your organization came about specifically related to the incident at Ferguson where Michael Brown, a young African-American, unarmed, was shot and killed by a police officer in Ferguson. And of course, this has been a huge issue in all the media around the country. And more recently, of course, the situation in Ferguson was inflamed even further by the fact that a local grand jury refused to indict the police officer, Darren Wilson, in that particular incident. And then, of course, many of us also know about the situation that took place in New York City, Staten Island, where an African-American was also killed by the police, put in a chokehold, accused of resisting arrest and put in an illegal chokehold. And again, a grand jury considered whether there should be charges. I think the coroner did rule, in fact, that was a homicide.
Yep.
The grand jury also considered that case and did not bring charges. So one of the themes, I think, here has to do with violence that is committed by state officials and the fact that there is often a lack of legal accountability, to put it mildly. Some people might use the term impunity. And then let me just throw one other issue in here to kind of frame our discussion today. And that is that also this week, the Senate Intelligence Committee, led by Senator Dianne Feinstein, came out with a long-awaited, it wasn't even the full report, it was simply an executive summary, which ran to like over 500 pages, an executive summary of a much larger report on the use of torture by the CIA during the Bush administration. And it's a very damning report. Anybody who's been paying attention knew that there had been torture committed by the CIA. It's well documented. I have 15 books on my shelf at home that talk about various aspects of the torture program. But here we have an official agency of the U.S. government now coming out and admitting and providing some documentation of this. So there's been a lot of controversy swirling around this week about the torture report. Again, what we're talking about is the use of state violence with almost complete impunity. No one's going to be held accountable. No one who engaged in torture has any fear for being prosecuted, being held accountable. So
I think that's really important to
there's similar themes here. So those are sort of the broad issues that we're going to talk about today. But let's get started. Felix, let me come to you first. the incident in Ferguson. Now, I know that you can talk about that specific incident and some of the factors there, but you want to put it in a bit broader context, don't you?
So I was home for Thanksgiving, and in my house, we talk about politics, we talk about all kinds of stuff. And so we were talking about Ferguson, and my dad says to me, he says, you know, we've seen this movie before. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? He said, pick a decade, 70s, 80s, 60s, 50s, 40s, 30s. You could write the same story, the same headline, and the same results. And he immediately goes back to Emmett Till. And what happened in the Emmett Till case when, you know, he was accused of allegedly whistling at a white person, was taken out of his bed in the middle of the night from his family, beaten and tortured, and no one was ever held accountable. Law enforcement, no, they never found anybody. So my dad was like, you know, we've seen this before. History is rife with a narrative that basically says the lives of young black men aren't as valued the same way they are in other communities. It's just not that way. And he says, and that historical narrative is one that is carried by law enforcement in this country, but it's also carried by folks of color. And so that plays into every encounter that an African American has with the police. I mean, I had to talk when I was a kid about how I was supposed to act, what I was supposed to say and not say, do and not do if I ever had an encounter with the police, of which I've had many. And a lot of the things that my dad said and my grandfather said to me came to be true. My first encounter with the police happened when I was 16 years of age. We were, me and three of my friends were leaving a high school basketball game. We just finished playing a high school basketball game, and we were going to go to a party. And we stopped at an intersection, and the next thing we know, the police came at us from all sides. Took us out of the car, guns drawn, threw us to the ground. Didn't tell us what we were in trouble for or anything like that, just held us there for about 5 minutes, and then they let us up. And I was like, officer, why did you stop us? And he says, well, there was a gas station that I got robbed, and you guys fit the description. And so I said, well, if I may ask, what was the description? 4 African-American males, dark skin with short hair. And I said, well, that's basically everybody that I know. But so I recognized that the rules of the game for us were going to be different, and that the policing was going to be different.
But at the time of that incident, had your dad already had the talk with you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Because I was 16 years old at the time, so I'd had the talk when I was 10 or 11 years old about, you know, what I could expect, and that it was going to be different for me as an African-American young man, and I needed to expect that. And he said, my father said, don't get mad about it. This is the way it's going to be for you right now. I don't want you to be surprised or caught off guard, because it could mean the difference between you living and dying, how you act in those interactions.
Cody?
It breaks my heart. One of the in the organizational meetings that we have when we talk, this is a story that I wasn't aware of a lot before I got into racial justice, about the talk being as in African American families. This I hear so many mothers talking about right now after Ferguson, talking to their like 7-year-olds and 10-year-olds, and the pain in their eyes and their child's eyes when they understand that they're not safe by the people who are supposed to protect them, and that their mother has to explain that to them, has to have a talk about that. And then there are opposing viewpoints of people who say, I will not teach my child to act differently than a white man. He doesn't have to act differently. That's not, the onus is not on the person being oppressed to change their behavior, it's on the police officer. Now I understand that whether or not, that doesn't matter right now. Parents are trying to keep their kids safe.
Sure. You passed on to me the Nicholas Kristof column in the New York Times yesterday. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Nicholas Kristof writes for the New York Times, and he's written a series of 5 columns, and he's titled, and they're all titled, and they're provocative, when white people just don't get it. And what he's trying to say in those columns as a white male is that life for people of color in this country is different. The way they see the world is different. And the reason they see the world differently is because of all this history. And he says the pushback he gets is from people who say we're past that now. And what he's saying is, no, we're never past that. history is what got us to the point that we're at right now. And he talks about the fact that most middle-class whites can take for granted when their sons and daughters go out that they're going to be safe and that they have their relationships with the police are going to be, for the most part, fairly benign. But African Americans can't. They don't have that viewpoint because history has shown them that's not always the case, and that they can expect to be routinely harassed. They're 21 more times likely to die as a result of an encounter with a police officer than a white person would be, and that's knowledge that they're armed with when they go out into the community. And you got to think about it. So you see the world differently, and you approach things differently.
Yeah, one of the most important things I think is to talk about that history, and I try in my classes. I teach courses on criminal justice, criminology, and criminal justice at Western. And especially for the white students in the class, I think it's really important for me to try to communicate a bit about that history. And I'm a history buff from way back anyhow, but this is so critical because it's not just history, but it also is the way in which history gets encoded into social structures. Then, right?
Creating a narrative.
So we have to start with slavery, right? Yeah. I mean, a lot of people would like to paper over or forget or say we're past slavery, but slavery is not over, right? Slavery continues to affect us in all kinds of ways that we're not even consciously aware of in this society. The Civil War, we had to fight the bloodiest war in our history just to end that particular form of slavery that was taking place at that time in the 19th century. Then, of course, the Reconstruction period led to all kinds of controversies, was abruptly ended by a political deal in the Senate in the 1876 race. And as a consequence of the ending of Reconstruction early, we then entered into the phase of legalized segregation, particularly in the South, but also affecting the North. And one of the points I'd like to make in books that I would recommend for people to look at is a wonderful book, won a Pulitzer Prize, by Douglas Blackmun. It's called Slavery by Another Name. And I think it's really important to understand what Blackmun is documenting in this book. And the fact is that slavery did not end. Slavery continued after Reconstruction. And here's how it happened. It involved the criminal justice system. African American males would be arrested on a trumped up charge, totally bogus charge. They would be convicted on those bogus charges by white judges, and then their sentence would be to work for a local business,
or
a local corporation.
Company like the United States Steel.
Yeah. So in a sense, again, we are expropriating the labor of African Americans now under the aegis of the criminal justice system. And so again, what Blackmun's point is, slavery continued by another name, operating through the criminal justice system in conjunction with local business establishments.
And here's the other piece that if you go back to the area of Jim Crow, law enforcement played a major role in suppressing African Americans in the communities. So they weren't friends to the African American communities, particularly in the South. In fact, they were even more brutal than in some cases the slave masters in keeping blacks in line. There's a scene in the movie called The Help. And in that scene, there's an accident that takes place right in front of a bus. And it's nighttime. And all the African Americans who are doing day work are going home. Well, this accident happens at night, so the bus gets stopped, they're caught in traffic. They can't move. All the African Americans quickly get up off the bus and they start running. And the reason I was telling my wife is the reason they ran is because they knew that in those cities you could not be on the street after dark if you're an African American. You were going to be fair game. And you knew that law enforcement was not going to step in and help you.
Right. And so that slavery continued and continues, I would say, to this day with mass incarceration, if we're going to get there, and in the fact that, like, if you read the 13th Amendment, it says that slavery is legal as long as you are committed of a crime. I mean, specifically, not verbatim, but involuntary servitude or slavery shall be illegal except for as punishment for a crime, which is exactly what you guys were talking about.
Yeah.
Something else that I just wanted to add to Felix's point was that when a lot of people are talking about the system being broken, and we need to fix the system. But what I keep hearing from a lot of the African American people that I am working with is that the system isn't broken at all. The system is working exactly the way it was designed to work.
And I would agree with that.
Yeah.
And so, do we fix a system that how do you fix a broken system that it's not actually broken? I mean, this was what the system was built for, right? The system was built to oppress black people.
So you need a different kind of system.
Yeah.
That's what we really need. Yeah. Right. Yeah. You said before that encounter between a policeman and a black male is in a context, in a historical context and in a cultural context. Maybe you could enlarge on that a little
a
bit.
narrative. So if police historically have treated African Americans and the people of color differently and brutally over a series of decades, that gets transmitted down to police who come on the force over that same time period. That's part of the culture. This is how you do things. I remember there being a statement in the movie, the Jack Nicholson movie called Chinatown that he made back in the 70s.
Yeah.
And at the very end of the movie, a young person gets shot and killed. And the police officer looks at the other police officer and said, well, this is just Chinatown. This is how things are done. And I suspect that was a cultural message that exists today about how things get done in these communities of color or poorer communities, about how the police should act and comport themselves. And it's wholly different than the way they would act or comport themselves if they were in a middle-class neighborhood or upper middle-class neighborhood. And that's part of the police culture. It becomes a narrative. So it says, when you're over here, you treat these people differently. And so African Americans and other folks of color or poor people who live in poor communities then come to expect that to be.
Right.
To be that. That's how they're going to be treated. So they're automatically going to be hostile towards the police. And so when those people get together, particularly younger people, you're talking, that's a recipe for disaster.
Right.
That
Makes sense.
The concept that sociologists use talking about this history and the structural implications of it is systemic racism. So we talk about the system, but systemic racism, or the concept of institutional racism. And I think it's really, really important for many white people to understand that concept, because what it means is that racism can be embedded in social institutions and continue and have tremendously negative effects on the lives of African Americans, in a sense without any conscious racism on the part of people today, right? So you can have racism without racists to some extent, right? We still have racists, and make no mistake about that, but racism without racists, because even if you didn't have those racists, people who had the active prejudice, you still would have the institutional structure as it has historically evolved, set up in such a way as to continue to provide discrimination, restricting job opportunities, educational opportunities. I mean, there's so much about the structure itself. So it's systemic racism. It has evolved historically from the Jim Crow laws, from the experience of Reconstruction. And so that makes it deeply entrenched when we say the system's operating, maybe even not the way it was intended to be set up, but the way it certainly has evolved. And certainly there's some intentionality in terms of controlling African American labor that was built into the system Blackman was talking about. And certainly there's a new book out which looks at how the capitalist system was very much dependent, and economic development in the North was dependent upon African American slave labor first, and then African American labor. So, so again, systemic racism, the way in which it is built into the institutional structure. So it may well be that there are many white Americans today who say, "Well, I'm not racist. I don't see myself as being prejudiced," but they don't understand, and they think that we're sort of past this because we have an African American who's been elected president, and there's obvious signs of progress. You can look to, there's LeBron James making millions of dollars, and there's all these other entertainers, and they're successful, and so it's for them it's like, well, haven't we got past that? But no, in a very significant and fundamental way, we haven't got past it, because that historical social structure, that institutionalized racism, still continues to operate. I think it's so important for my students to understand that we're not past, the past is not past.
And what I do in my classes, I draw this diagram. And I'm sure you guys have seen it sociologically. It's the iceberg diagram. And I tell my students, on the top of the iceberg, what you see above the waterline, that's overt racism. That's use of the N word and this and all that kind of stuff. But below, if in the iceberg, the larger mass is what goes on below the surface that people can't see, what's in people's mind and what's in people's hearts. They don't necessarily express, but it manifests itself in the way they act, in hiring, and things like that. But it doesn't show up. People say, like you said, I'm not a racist, but if we look at an institution such as the court that I worked at for just under 30 years, I walked in there in 1982, 1983, I should say. And the leadership team at the court, with the exception of one person of color, looks exactly the way the leadership team at the court today in 2014. But yet these are good and well-meaning people, but the outcome is still the same.
Yeah.
You don't have any folks of color there at all. And no one's using the N-word, no one says those words anymore, but the optics are exactly the same. And that's the part I think people don't get.
Right.
When things don't change.
So the concept they use talking with police these days is implicit racism. The racism that people don't even realize that they have, because they've been socialized into a system which is racist, which teaches them white superiority, maybe not explicitly, not in words, but just in the way that people act towards other people, and you internalize that. And then you go out on the street and you don't even know that that's there, but it's there.
And then what happens is, I listened to the NPR this morning, they were interviewing a former African-American police officer who's a borough president now, and he says because that culture and the way of thinking happens, he said police officers on the street will go from 0 to 100 in terms of how they handle an individual if that person is in a poorer community or a person of color. There's no nuance there at all. He says here you got the situation in New York where you've got a guy selling illegal cigarettes. Why should that situation be met with overwhelming force?
Right.
See, because the officer didn't understand that there's something between 0 and 100.
Yeah.
You don't just go to 100 because the person is being disagreeable to you. But if that's what you've been enculturated to believe, this is how these people should be treated, you're going to go right to there. You're going to go to maximum use of force. This is how we deal with folks who act this way towards us.
On all the instances that have been publicized, one of the things that is so clear is there is no effort to de-escalate the situation. No effort to de-escalate. Immediately, as you say, it goes to force. Yeah. I guess the most explicit one was Cleveland when they shot that 12-year-old kid. Just pulled up in a car, pulled the gun out, and shot the kid immediately.
Car was not even stopped.
Yeah, the car wasn't even stopped. So,
that was an execution.
There's no way. Right.
Yeah, in the literature, again, sociological literature, there's the concept of racial frames.
Yeah.
The way in which situations get framed, and in a sense what that means, again, is the way in which certain situations are defined or given social meaning. And those frames are long established. They grow out of this history that we're talking about. And people carry these frames around, and they become sort of normalized, particularly within organizational cultures. You were getting at this issue a little bit earlier, that police departments have their own internal culture, ways in which they see the world, define the world. Some of these frames are certainly there. And black officers can have some of the same frames because they become socialized into the organizational culture. And we have a lot of evidence that organizational cultures can normalize certain kinds of deviant activities or practices so that the people within the culture don't see them as deviant or abnormal. People from outside looking in may say, what the hell are you guys doing? They may point out the deviant practices, but within the organizational culture, often people don't see the way in which the practices and beliefs and frames are departing from certain other kinds of important social norms.
And think about that. Let's go outside the realm of police and go back to 2006, 2005, 2006, and talk about what happened on Wall Street. Now, I'm reading Michael Lewis's book, Flash Boys, and he's talking about the same thing you're talking about. You had a culture inside these banks and corporate institutions that the behavior they were engaging in, which was basically outright fraud, was somehow okay.
Yeah.
These guys knew exactly what they were doing when they were selling these toxic assets to these other banks. They were making money off this. So they rationalized their behavior, but they knew it was wrong. But the culture encouraged that.
And they never were held accountable for it. Nobody went to jail.
Nobody went to jail.
Nobody died. Nobody got shot.
Right. Right.
So but your point is well taken, Ron. But when a culture encourages something over many, many years, anybody who comes into that culture, either they adapt or they move on. But if they stick around, more than likely they're going to adapt to those ways of doing things.
It becomes the common sense of the
And I
culture.
think it's really important to bring up 2 points right now, is that people do speak about one of the solutions being, okay, we need more people of color in our force, we need diversity in our force. I think that is important. It's important to note that when Eric Garner was killed, there was an African American female police officer there and a Latino police officer there.
Wow. Didn't
save his life. Body cameras, we talk about, that's a whole other issue, but Tamir Rice and Eric Garner, cameras did not save their lives. The second point that I wanted to make was, now I'm going to forget it and lose my train of thought.
You'll pick it up.
Yeah, I will pick it up.
I'm sure we'll get back to it.
Anyways, I'm sorry.
Let me jump in and say I really want to be fair, because I have many students over the years who have become police officers, who want to be police officers. They're very good and decent people. They want to become police officers because they want to help. They want to protect and serve. And so that's what attracts them to the profession. They think that policing can be a force for good in the community, and that they do that model, protect and serve. That's what they're all about. And we also have, so I want to get that out there. But again, putting people who have those kinds of instincts then into an organizational culture in which they become trained or socialized and pick up certain kinds of frames, and again, the normalization of certain kinds of practices. Good people can do bad things within an organizational position. That's one thing that we know. But we also have to be fair. Policing in this country has made some strides. There have been serious efforts. I mean, we can go back again to 1919. There were race riots all across the U.S. in 1919. These were riots by whites against blacks. Detroit, Chicago, it started in Chicago.
Yeah.
There was an investigation at that time of the police, because the police did nothing. All white police forces did absolutely nothing. They let white thug gangs go marauding through black neighborhoods and beat and kill people and burn homes and businesses. They did nothing. There was an investigation, a report to try to reform the police. Those that were put on the shelf, they were never acted upon. The same exact thing happened in 1943. Again, there were many white riots across the country in 1943, right in the middle of World War II. And again, because we'd had a large influx of African Americans that had come north to take positions in the factories, the same kind of things happened. Whites beating up blacks, killing and murdering with impunity, right? Again, all white police forces did absolutely nothing. There were, again, investigations. The reports this time, however, were taken more seriously, and there were certain efforts to try to bring about reforms. And so the term police community relations comes into existence at this time. Now, police community relations is code for police black community relations, right?
Yeah.
Because there's not really usually a problem between the white community and policing, although poor people feel the wrath of policing in other ways, right? But mostly when that term police community relations meant police African American communities. And there were efforts that were made to try to deal with that and improve those relationships. And if we go forward then into then opening up of police departments, African Americans being hired, female officers being hired, Latino officers being hired, and again,
And then going to a more professional police force, to more education.
More professionalized. We get police officers now who have to have a college degree to be on the force. Hopefully they've taken my course and they're learning some things before they get on the force. But you also have this huge community policing movement that developed, right? So community policing is a kind of a philosophy of policing. It's not really any particular set of practices, but it's a broad philosophy in which the police are supposed to work closely with the community to identify problems, work on those problems. It's not about arresting people and cracking heads. It's about
it's proactive as opposed to reactive.
Prevention.
Good, excellent, great way to frame it. Now, you've got that movement, but there's always been resistance to that within the police culture, right? There are a lot of police officers who don't want to be social workers. I've heard that more than once. I don't want to be a social worker. I want to be a cop. And in their mind, being a cop means a more aggressive, going after the bad guys kind of thing, reacting to the bad things, rather than being proactive to identify community problems. So within police departments, you have that tug of war that's going on, where there have been efforts to reform, efforts to move toward community policing, running up against these entrenched organizational cultures, that larger history that we've already talked about. So, I mean, I think we need to be fair that there are many police departments. Our police department, I think, has tried hard.
Very hard.
They still have problems, though. There's still
Absolutely.
some deeply rooted problems. But I think Jeff Hadley has been at least somewhat
Strenuous
proactive on trying to deal with these issues.
They haven't tried to redact anything. I've talked to Hadley a couple of times. They have at least admitted and understand that, yeah, we got some problems here. We got some issues here, racial profiling and otherwise, that we need to deal with at a departmental level. They've at least been willing to have that conversation and take some tangible steps to make some changes. Because a lot of police agencies would have been resistant to that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's taking federal government consent decrees to get police agencies to move forward on any of these issues.
Right. I mean, one of the things that he's done is he brought in Lori Rydell, I guess her name is, from Florida, who's supposed to be the #1 person in the country training police about implicit racism and how to get beyond that. And we had her here for a week. I went to 2 days of her sessions with the officer staff. She's very strong, very good, and she does it in a way that she doesn't call people racist. She says it's implicit racism, it's in the back of your head that you don't know, and then what do you do about it? That's the big thing. And then after the officer staff, she spent the rest of the week with the rest of the police force. I mean, that was a pretty good investment, you know, to do that. And that's just one of the steps that he's taken here.
I mean, I think this brings up, though, a lot of the problem, and especially with the grassroots organizing and what people are trying to change in this country, in the sense that, again, if you think the system works fine and it's broken, then you can try these little reforms to fix it, which I would argue haven't manifested in. You were speaking about policing not going after small offenses and cracking down on people. So that happens in the city consistently, especially on the north side. So I don't know and I'm not saying that overall in the country maybe that has gone down. But if you think that the system, again, works, then yeah, you can fix it. But again, we don't say there are not good people who put on that badge, but when you pick up that badge, you know what you're doing. You have chosen to join an institutionally racist system, and maybe you don't know what you're doing. It's our job to make people aware of that don't, but I believe, and then once you're into the force, you should very quickly, as a good person, understand that the things that are being said to you, around you, are not okay, and that you would no longer want to participate that. And we would call on police officers who think they're good police officers to put down their badge and come join us in the streets.
So you don't want police officers out there?
Okay, look, so, and I'm not saying what we want. I'm not speaking for what we want. I'm speaking for my personal opinion here. And there's a lot of different ideas. No, there are some people who would say, no, we don't want any police officers. There are some people that would say that. We will police our own communities. When we're talking about community policing, they're talking about citizen community policing. And no, I wouldn't say that we don't want police officers. I would say that the system has to be drastically changed, that we live in a police state. Again, you said it doesn't affect white people in the same way, and it doesn't affect white people in the same way. It does affect everyone in some way right now.
It doesn't affect
We are
white people
over-policed.
the same
We
way.
have too many laws. Police intimidate and use, they have tanks in Ferguson, Missouri. Like, our police system is out of control in this country.
Well, one of the things is, if we talk about the roots of this thing, you got to talk about class. You got to talk about poverty. You got to talk about why do people end up breaking the law. And that's very connected. You talk about this all the time, about the idea that if people are going to try to survive in the ways they can, and if they can't get a legitimate way to survive, they're going to try other things that are going to enable them to survive. That's counter to what the laws say, and therefore there's going to be this conflict here. So we have to do something about class if we're going to do something about this issue.
I agree, 100%. I do want to push back and say also, though, that when you're policing a specific neighborhood and profiling them, you're going to find crime in that neighborhood, right? If you're not policing white neighborhoods as much, you're not going to find as much white crime. So the fact that, I guess, saying that possibly getting to that black people commit more crime because they don't have as much money, I think is a part of the problem in this country, but not the problem that will still solve full policing, or the reason that black people are brutalized in this country. I don't think it's because
I think it's much. There are many factors.
Yeah.
One of them is race, of course. That's
Right.
at the forefront.
But I would bring in William Julius Wilson,
Yes.
the great sociologist at Harvard, who has been very controversial throughout his career, wrote a book about the declining significance of race, and he was here a couple years ago, and we
Walker
talked
Institute, yeah.
we talked to him about that. He said, of course I didn't mean, he's an African-American male himself, and he's been subjected to many of the same issues that you've dealt with in your life. He said, of course I didn't mean race wasn't important anymore, but we have to take into account the intersection of race and class. That
Absolutely.
economic inequality and poverty have been racialized because of this history that we're talking about. And so his best book, I think, if anybody out there is interested, William Julius Wilson, he's got a little book called More Than Race.
Just race. Yeah.
More Than Just Race. And I think he does a brilliant job of connecting the dots here. And the racial history is important, but it's the class position, it's the economic disadvantage that so many people of color face. And of course there are many Americans who face those same economic disadvantages and also find themselves policed in a way that's different from the middle class or the corporations. And so there's, at one level, of course, and Cody's right, policing is geared toward dealing with particular types of criminal behavior. So it focuses on the crimes more likely to be committed by working class, lower class individuals. Right. And it focuses on certain kinds of crimes. The white-collar crimes, the corporate crimes, the political crimes are off base. The Wall Street bankers can do whatever the hell they want to. The CIA gets away with torture. There is a divide. Matt Taibbi's book, The Divide, talks about the fact that we have two very different systems of justice, right? Two very different systems of justice. If you're wealthy, you are subjected to a totally different system than if you're poor. And if you're poor and black, then that's double the disadvantage there. So in my classes, whenever I'm talking about criminology and we're going over some of the basic statistics, official statistics about crime, right? The things that are recorded in the FBI's uniform crime reports, I always have to say, okay, this shows a disproportionate amount of involvement by young African-American males in the criminal justice system in criminal behavior in terms of arrests, but don't forget the white-collar crime.
Yeah.
I think my students get tired of me talking about white-collar crime, but it's always, but don't forget the white-collar crime. That doesn't show up in the official statistics, but we got to...
Nor do the costs of that crime are, that are associated with that
Right.
crime show up.
and
Exactly.
the costs are, the property crimes are a drop in the bucket compared to the kind of crimes that the white-collar get the banks. Just take the 2008 banks frauds that you were talking about earlier, massive amounts of money that were involved there. So we got to, the other point that I think I would make about this, going back to Taibbi's point about the divide, is the fact that there's a lack of legal accountability then for people in the system. So here we have some instances where officers, highly publicized incidents where police officers have killed unarmed African Americans, and yet is there any legal accountability?
Yeah.
Maybe people don't understand the grand jury. A grand jury is not a trial jury. It is a secret proceeding. Prosecutors control all the flow of information to a grand jury. Actually, grand juries are used in two different ways. Grand juries can be used to routinely review criminal charges. We don't do that in Michigan. In Ohio, they do. So anytime a prosecutor brings forth a charge, it's going to go in front of a grand jury who has to find probable cause. It's a routine review of all cases. We don't do that in Michigan. We operate not with a grand jury indictment, for the most part, with the prosecutor's information as the charging document. In Michigan, we would only use grand juries in a special investigatory function. Missouri does both, but in this case with Ferguson, they were using it in an investigatory way. And so you bring the evidence into the grand jury and you say, well, what do you think? Do you want to indict? Now, of course, the joke that everybody's heard many, many times is that a prosecutor can indict a ham sandwich if they want to, right?
Yeah.
Prosecutor controls all the information. There's no defense attorney. There's no, if the prosecutor doesn't call you as a witness or present the information, it's not going to get to the grand jury. It's a secret proceeding. It goes by a majority vote. You don't need a unanimous verdict on the part of the grand jury to indict somebody. And the standard is probable cause, which is the lowest standard of proof in the system. If we're at a trial, the trial jury has to do beyond a reasonable doubt, the highest standard. Probable cause is the lowest standard. So it's easy to get an indictment. It's pretty easy to establish probable cause. Clearly there was probable cause in the Ferguson case
yeah.
involving Darren Wilson. Clearly there was probable cause involved in
Eric
Staten Island.
Garner.
Clearly there was probable cause. But again, what we had was these grand jury proceedings. So we know that the prosecutors didn't want indictments in those cases, right? Prosecutors could have had indictments if they wanted to. In those cases, they did not. They did not want them. They did not get them. Prosecutors acted as defense attorneys for the police officers. So there's that connection. There's often conflict between police and prosecutors over
Except for
certain
this.
issues, but on this issue, they're going to be united.
And it seems to be the norm that, with the exception of police officers, the vast majority of grand juries come back with probable cause. In the
And
vast
very-
majority of criminal cases.
Very low percentage for
with the
police.
exception of police officers. When it comes to police officers, then it's just, the tables are turned completely around. They did an article in the New York Times last week that outlined 6 prominent cases that have happened in New York over the last 20 years. Very prominent, made the news and everything. And each time the verdict from the grand jury was not to indict the police officer.
And if there is probable cause and a grand jury doesn't indict, then everything stops. And so there's no opportunity for there to be a trial. So let's say if the grand jury had returned an indictment against Darren Wilson, that didn't mean he was guilty.
No, not at
It
all.
meant that there now was going to have to be a trial. And so the evidence would be presented by the prosecution. Darren Wilson would have been able to mount a defense. A jury now drawn from the community would hear the case. He would have to be convicted beyond a reasonable, the evidence would have to be beyond a reasonable doubt in order for them to convict them. And again, there was conflicting testimony in the case, there was conflicting information, so maybe there wouldn't have been, maybe a jury would have said, no, we don't find that he was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
But it should at least have gone to
But
that
at least
stage.
should have gone to that point. It's
There would have
clear there was enough evidence for probable cause, and in Staten Island, it's, you know. I mean,
Transparency.
you've
There
got
would
the
have been
video, you've got the
transparency.
video
Everybody
there,
could have
so.
seen what
And so
was going on.
something that, as we talk about solutions moving forward, to some ways we can fix the system, and that I do feel comfortable speaking about, is that we do believe that a solution is that a special prosecutor should be brought in for any case involving, not even death, any case involving use of force, excessive use of force with a police officer. Because when you're talking about it, the prosecutors do have relationships with the police officers.
they do.
They're giving them evidence. They're their friends. You don't want to go to work every day with some. They don't want to see their friends go to jail.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's right.
And it's not unheard of for a prosecutor from a neighboring county to be brought in to investigate a particular case because of the close relationship between a prosecutor and a police officer. It's not unheard of to do that, or to appoint a special prosecutor. In the case of the torture report, certainly a special prosecutor would have to be appointed, as we had back when the Watergate days. There was a special prosecutor. Everybody knows Nixon fired the first special prosecutor because he was getting too close to the evidence, right? But a special prosecutor was brought in, working with a grand jury on the Watergate case. So a similar model needs to be done with the torture report, and again, with local instances like we saw in Ferguson and Staten Island. I think that's certainly a model that there has to be more legal accountability. I mean, that's at least a first step, right? That's not changing the system, but at least we have to have some accountability. If we have accountability, then at least we can perhaps have punishment for wrongdoing. We can have some level of deterrence, right? We can have some level of public condemnation, and those are starts. You aren't going to change the system unless you can develop that kind of accountability and that kind of public condemnation. And the first place to start would be to at least make sure that we have instances like this, that there is going to be some kind of legal accountability.
Right. So I think that's really where we need to go. How do we get out of this? What are the ways to move forward on this issue? What do you think on that?
Well, I think there's inside the system fixes, and I think Ron outlined what he thinks those are, and I would agree with that. The special prosecuting piece that you talked about, I think that should be standard boilerplate. Anytime there's a police involved in excessive force, or particularly death, they should bring a special prosecutor in. I would agree with that. And I think from the outside, people need to continue to push to keep law enforcement accountable for what they do. That pressure has to be there. They have to know that. If they think this is going to go away, they'll just wait people out.
Yeah.
They'll say, yeah, this will fade for the newspapers, and 6 months from now we'll be talking about something else. And it can't be that way. The pressure has to be there at all times so that the police know that they're going to be held accountable. Like you talked about before, transparency. To me, that's critical.
Yeah. The training, I think, is important. You got to keep working on that training. You got to get to the implicit racism and get people acting in a different kind of way. I think there are two things, but I think we have to do something about inequality. To me, if you don't do something about inequality, I think we're going to have these problems coming up more and more and more.
We have the largest wealth gaps in this country between people of color and other folks, even more so than they had in South Africa during their apartheid era.
It's incredible.
And that speaks volumes.
It does.
You know,
It really
I've been
does.
reading Thomas Piketty's book on capital,
Yeah.
and he talks about the history of that sort of thing. And what he says is that when societies get to the point where that gap is so big and unmanageable, what you've gotten historically is revolutions.
Right.
Going back to the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, they all had gotten to a tipping point with respect to inequality in those societies that the people said, you know, we can't stand for this anymore.
That's right. I saw a chart the other day from PolicyLink, which is a very good website. And they were showing that since 1981, of course, the gross national product has doubled, but worker salaries have decreased. And it's just not that they've decreased, it's that for African American men, they have decreased much more than they have for white men. So that now the average white person who's got a job is averaging around $21 an hour, whereas the average black person who's got some kind of a decent job is averaging $16 an hour. And it's a $5 gap. And it's been consistent that way across. And more black men aren't working. More and more white men aren't working, too. So the inequality thing, I think, is at the heart of it. The police are supposed to enforce the laws of a system that doesn't work for a lot of people.
Correct.
And so there's a built-in contradiction there.
Yep.
There's a built-in contradiction that is very difficult to get across.
Police officers are supposed to protect the existing economic system,
right.
political and economic system. When in class, everybody in my class knows about Rosa Parks, right? But, you know, there's been Black History and Martin Luther King holiday, so everybody knows Martin Luther King and they know Rosa Parks. So I say to my students, well, what happened to Rosa Parks? Everybody celebrates Rosa Parks. She didn't give up her seat on the bus, right? So what happened to her? Well, she got arrested. Yeah, the police came, right? They arrested her. They took her down to the station. They fingerprinted her. They photographed her, right? They put her in jail. They arrested her. The police came, and they arrested this woman for not giving up her seat on the bus. And what happened to Martin Luther King? He got arrested time after time after time. In fact, that was part of his strategy, right? Nonviolent civil disobedience of unjust laws, get arrested. I think the most famous piece of writing from Martin Luther King may be his letter from a Birmingham jail, right?
Yes.
And of course, other ministers came to him and said, Martin, what are you doing in there? Well, he had to explain why this was the way we had to protest, the way we had to fight back against an unjust system. And so where are you going to end up? You're going to end up in jail. And so I think, again, that's something that has to be understood. If the police are there to protect the existing social and economic system. And so, you know, if you're going to challenge that system, then there's going to be this conflict.
The way African Americans did in the 50s and 60s.
Exactly.
Challenge that system to be asked to be treated the same way everybody else was treated. And they were met by the state in the form of the police and National Guard with being put in jail and beaten and whatever. And so that also is a history that, as an African American young man growing up, that I also saw. So what am I going to think about the police? This is what I see on TV.
Yeah.
When I see fire hoses and I see dogs and I see people being thrown in jail by the police, the people that are supposed to protect us.
Bull Connor, Jim Clark. I mean, I still remember those names.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
You know, they were sheriffs down there in Alabama, and they were the ones with ordering their officers to use the water
hoses
hoses
and the dogs.
and throwing little kids across the street with the water, sicking the dogs on them. And I mean, I think that was certainly one of the things that had a big impact on me, sitting in my living room in small town Ohio, watching this brutality going on. It was the beginning of having some kind of consciousness raised to see that kind of police brutality. But that's part of the system. So again, if we have social movements that are going to be challenging the system, it's going to run into this one. And I would add in on top of that the increasing militarization of
Oh, yeah.
policing in the
Right.
United States today. I mean, one of my colleagues in criminology, Peter Kreska, down at Eastern Kentucky University, has become a national expert on the militarization of policing. He's been interviewed dozens of times recently because of all the controversy about these programs where the Pentagon's giving all kinds of weapons and equipment to local policing. But again, as policing moves into that kind of a mode, it's moving far, far away from the community policing model
Yeah.
and the accountability model that we were hoping we were moving in that particular direction with the reform movements. And now a lot of that's being completely undone by this militarization of policing that's going on.
And the element where race comes into it is that when you take a population and you define them and create a narrative that says these folks are the other,
Yeah,
that then allows you to go in and treat these people differently than you would treat other people.
that's right.
And when you falsely continue to say that America is a meritocracy, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So that you're where you are because you deserved it or because of what you did, and we don't talk about privilege, and so then you see a lot of black people in jail and poor. Well, black people must be criminals and
Right.
poor because we're in a country where you get what you
Yeah.
work for. And that's absolutely never not challenged often, I would say, especially in public.
I think that's such a very good point. And I don't know if you saw there was a poll that was published in the New York Times yesterday about the economic system. And one of the questions was, do you think the economic system is fair? Do you think that everybody has a chance to achieve a decent life? 52% of American people said it's fair. It's obviously not
Yeah.
fair. I mean,
No.
if it were fair, we wouldn't have so much poverty, we wouldn't have so many people falling out of middle class, but they've done a wonderful job in brainwashing people to say that this system is fair.
Well, and when talking about classes, part of the brilliant strategy is that they convince black people in the same socioeconomic, like in Katrina, right? So there are these two separate neighborhoods. So one is predominantly black, one is predominantly white. They are like the same class. And they hate each other, and they both think that like the other one is the problem. So like they've convinced, instead of people joining together on class, they split them by race.
Yeah.
So that they would never join together and create and get that power.
Very good point.
Race has always been a wedge issue
Yeah.
in the American political
Yeah.
system, at least in
Slavery. Since
at least since slavery, but more particularly in the 20th century.
Oh, yeah.
I try to tell my students, did you know that the South was solidly Democratic at one point?
Yeah.
And how did it change? I mean, it was Democratic because of the Civil War. Lincoln was Republican. The Reconstruction was led by the Republicans. But race was one of the key wedge issues. Welfare and crime, both code words for African Americans, were used as wedge issues in the South to divide the white working class from the black working class and to transform the politics of the South into
Yeah.
a solidly Republican black away from a solidly Democratic black.
And that after the Civil Rights Act passed, that's what they told President Johnson, that within a generation you're gonna lose the South
You lost the
completely.
whole South.
Yeah, and he knew it. He knew it.
And he knew it.
We've got just a few minutes left, but we've got some events that are coming up that we want to let people know about that deal with the issues we've been talking about today. One of them is that on the Martin Luther King holiday, which will be January 19th, there's going to be a teach-in at Western Michigan University in which we are going to address Ferguson and Staten Island and the broader issue of racism and policing and social justice in the United States. And we don't have a room or a time for that. It'll probably be in the afternoon, but it will be on Martin Luther King holiday. So if people are interested, they can contact the Walker Institute. We'll
Yes.
have that information. The Walker Institute on Race and Ethnic Relations. So the College of Arts and Sciences is helping to organize this. So you can maybe contact the College of Arts and Sciences to find the room and the date. But we hope to have some breakout sessions where people have an opportunity to talk about these important issues. And Don, the Walker Institute is also organizing a series on mass incarceration. You want to tell us a little bit about
We're
that?
going to have a series of discussions, community discussions, talking about stopping the flow of mass incarceration in Kalamazoo, specifically focusing on here. How do we keep people out of the criminal justice system? And we're going to look at different aspects of that. So we'll be nailing that down over the next couple weeks, I guess, but it's going to be a series of 4 different community meetings on that focus. Because once you get, you know this, and once you get into the criminal justice system, it follows you around for the rest of your life, and we got to keep people out of that.
And a lot of this is based on the Michelle Alexander book,
Yeah.
The New Jim Crow, where she's talking about mass incarceration and showing or connecting it with this history that we've been talking about. And we'd hoped to bring Michelle Alexander here, but apparently she's
Booked
not.
for the next year and a half.
Yeah,
I can imagine.
she's very, very popular law professor at Ohio State University. I think she has some young children too, so she's
yes, she does.
limiting her.
Yeah.
And
her
I
speaking schedule.
would be remiss if I didn't get a chance just to mention my organization, not my organization, but the organization I work with, Kalamazoo for Justice. We don't have any events currently coming up, but I mean, we do have events currently coming up. The information is not available. If you go to Kalamazoo for Justice with the number 4, people can get connected with us. And as we talked about, how does this end? I believe that it ends with the movement that has started now in Ferguson and nationwide. And so I would just encourage anyone that wants to continue to stay plugged in to connect with us that way.
Good.
All right, so there's lots going on, lots more discussion about this issue taking place in our community, so we hope that people will be able to take advantage of that in the coming months. We didn't talk too much about the torture report. I guess we'll have to save most of that for the next time. But again, there are those similarities where, again, impunity, lack of legal accountability for state crimes is the main theme. So I do see some very strong connections between the Senate torture report and what happened with the CIA after 9/11 and with what's been happening on the local level with policing. So we want to draw those connections together, and we'll hopefully have an opportunity to talk more about that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank our guests. Felix, always
you.
good to see you. Thanks for coming back on the program. Cody, glad to have you on the show, and I'm happy to hear that there's an organization of young people that are working on this issue for social justice.
Lots.
Right. Great.
Don?
Well, it's so great to see all the young people that you've mobilized around this issue, Cody. That's so important.
Don, always good to see you, and I
Good to
know
see you,
that
Don.
through the Walker Institute, some of these same issues will be addressed in that series coming up.
Yeah.
And we invite you to come back and join us again on Critical Issues, Alternative Views. Certainly this is one of the most critical issues, and you definitely got some alternative views today about this particular issue. So thank you for being with us. We hope to see you again soon.